The Monday after Thanksgiving, I called my attorney. Not my son, not my daughter-in-law. My attorney. I told her to start the paperwork. All of it. She asked if I was sure. I said I had never been more sure of anything in my life. She said she'd have the documents ready by Friday. I hung up the phone, made myself a cup of tea, and sat by the window watching the birds at the feeder. A little chickadee kept getting pushed off by a bigger bird. Then it came back. Waited. Found its moment. Took what it needed and flew away. I thought, yes, that's exactly it. Let me back up. My name is Harriet. No, wait. Everyone calls me Hattie. That's what my mother called me, and that's what I've been for 67 years. Hattie Morse. I worked for 31 years as a seamstress and alterations specialist at Bellworth's department store in Claremont, Ohio. I pressed other women's wedding dresses. I let out the waistbands of men's suit pants. I reattached buttons and relined coats that had seen better decades. I ate my lunch at a small table in the back room next to the steam press. I drove a 2009 Honda Civic that I kept meticulous. I clipped coupons. I wore the same winter coat for 11 years. What people did not know about me, what I chose not to tell them, is that I had been quietly buying commercial real estate since 1987. My late husband Gerald started it. He was an electrician, union, sharp with numbers in a way that never showed on his face. We bought our first small strip mall when our son was 3 years old. Gerald said, "We're not going to be rich by looking rich. We're going to be rich by being patient." I believed him. I still believe him, even though he's been gone 14 years. When Gerald died, I kept going. I sold the strip mall and bought 2 office buildings in the kind of mid-size Ohio towns that people fly over but never land in. Towns where a decent building with decent tenants will make you money for 40 years if you don't get greedy. I worked with a property management company. I signed papers when I needed to sign papers. I showed up at Bellworth's at 8 a.m. and hemmed pants until 5. Nobody knew. That was the point. By the time I retired from Bellworth's at 63, my portfolio was worth a little over $4 million. I know that's not jaw-dropping by some people's standards, but it's mine, every stitch of it. I live in a 2-bedroom house in the same neighborhood I've lived in for 38 years. I painted it myself 2 summers ago, pale yellow with white trim, because Gerald always wanted yellow. The pipes don't rattle. The roof is new. I know every crack in the sidewalk out front. I am not going anywhere, and I'm not apologizing for staying. My son's name is Preston. He's 38. I raised him alone after Gerald died, when Preston was 24, old enough to grieve but young enough to still need steadying. I steadied him. He finished his MBA. He got a good job in finance over in Columbus. I was proud. I am still proud, in the complicated way you can be proud of someone who has also disappointed you deeply. 3 years ago, Preston married a woman named Sylvie Cabot-Wren. I want to be fair to Sylvie. I want to tell this honestly, the way I'd want someone to tell a story about me. So I'll say this: Sylvie is not a cruel person. She is a person who grew up in a world where everything was coded, where your car told people who you were, where your mother's jewelry told people who your mother was. She learned to read those codes before she learned to read books. She can't help that. I understand it. I just couldn't live inside it. Her family, the Cabot-Wrens, threw the engagement party. It was at a country club in Dublin, Ohio. I wore my good navy dress. I drove myself. I parked in the regular lot, not valet, because I didn't see the point. When I walked in, Sylvie's mother, Constance, and I am not making this name up, she truly is a Constance, looked at me the way you look at a piece of furniture you're not sure belongs in the room. She was perfectly polite. That's what made it so efficient. Preston was happy that night. I held on to that. The incident happened 8 months later at Thanksgiving. We held it at Preston and Sylvie's house, a very large, very new house in a very new development outside Columbus. The kind of place where all the trees are the same height because they were all planted the same year. I brought 2 things: a sweet potato casserole I'd made from scratch, and a gift for their news. Sylvie was pregnant. They'd told me in October. Just me, family, before the wider announcement. I was so happy I cried in my car on the drive home. A grandchild. Gerald would have been beside himself, so I brought a gift. It wasn't wrapped in anything fancy. It was a card, and inside the card was something I'd been saving for exactly this kind of moment. A U.S. savings bond I had purchased in 1994 in the amount of $100 in Gerald's name, meant for a grandchild that never came in time for him to meet. I'd kept it in my fireproof box for 29 years. A bond like that after that many years is worth considerably more than face value. But more than the money, I wanted them to have something of Gerald's. Something he had chosen and signed and meant. I didn't explain all that at the table. I handed Sylvie the card during the dessert course and let her open it. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at her sister. Sylvie's sister Bex was there with her husband, and she made a sound. It was a short sound, almost a laugh, but not quite. The kind of sound a person makes when they're trying to keep something in and it comes out sideways. A savings bond, she said, to Bex, not to me. Bex looked at it. Is that from, how old is this? 1994, Sylvie said. She set it down on the table. Not back in the card, just on the tablecloth next to the pie. I looked at my son. Preston was cutting himself a second slice of pecan pie. He glanced up, caught my eye, and looked away. That was the thing. Not Sylvie, not Bex. Preston looked away. He said Mom's always been a saver. Like it was an apology. Like being a saver was the thing that needed excusing. Sylvie's mother, Constance, who was seated across from me, smiled in a way that involved only her mouth. She said, "How thoughtful." I picked up the card. I tucked the bond back inside. I said, "I think I'm going to head out." "Long drive," Preston said. "Mom, it's barely 7. I said, "I know. Thank you for dinner." I hugged my son. I did not make it a short hug. I held on because I love him and because I was not sure what came next. Then I got my coat, said goodbye to everyone, and walked to my car in the cold. I sat there for a few minutes. Then I drove home and called my best friend Vera, who has known me since 1981 and who never once in 40 years has looked at me sideways. She said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I don't know yet." She said, "Yes, you do." She was right. I just wasn't ready to say it out loud. The thing you have to understand is that this was not the first time. It was the clearest time, the moment that had a shape to it, that I could point to, but it wasn't the first. There was the Christmas 2 years before, when Sylvie redecorated their guest room and just mentioned, that she hoped I wouldn't mind staying at the Marriott next time because the guest room was now a proper study. Preston said they'd pay for the room. I said that was fine. There was the birthday dinner where Sylvie told a story about her college roommate's mother who was adorable, worked at a craft store, very sweet, reminds me of you. And she meant it kindly. I know she meant it kindly. That made it worse somehow. There was Preston's work holiday party, where I overheard Sylvie telling a colleague that Preston's mother was retired, very low-key, doesn't really get out much. I was standing 6 feet away by the shrimp cocktail. She hadn't seen me. I ate my shrimp and didn't say anything. Every one of those moments, I told myself, she doesn't know, she's making assumptions, let it go. But there in my car in the cold, outside their big new house in the treeless development, I thought about Gerald's bond sitting on that tablecloth like an oversight. And I thought, she's not gonna know unless I let her. And I've been letting her for 3 years. More importantly, my son had looked away. That was the part I kept returning to. Not Sylvie's sound, not Constance's smile. Preston looking away. I spent December thinking. I walked a lot. I have a route around my neighborhood that takes 45 minutes if I don't stop. I did it every morning. I thought about Gerald, about what he would say. I thought he would say, "Hattie, you know what to do. You just don't want to do it yet." I called my attorney, whose name is Josephine Aquinobi, and who has handled my real estate affairs for 17 years. I told her I wanted to review my estate planning documents. She said, "Come in any time." I went in the second week of December. We sat in her office, which smells like good coffee and old paper, which is the smell of serious things being handled carefully. I told her what had happened at Thanksgiving. Not the whole history, just the bond on the tablecloth. Just Preston looking away. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "And what do you want the documents to say?" I said, "I want to create a formal trust structure. I want my assets to pass to a charitable foundation first, with Preston able to apply for distributions at the trustee's discretion. I want the trustee to be someone who is not related to me or my son." She said, "That's a significant change." I said, "Yes." She said, "And you've thought about this?" I said, "I walked 45 minutes a day for a month." "Yes." She said, "Okay, give me 3 weeks." In January, something happened that I had not planned for. My son called me. Not a text, he called. On a Tuesday evening, which is not when Preston calls. He calls Sunday mornings, usually, quick, while Sylvie is at yoga. Tuesdays meant something had happened. He said, "Mom, are you okay?" I said, "I'm fine. Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I've been thinking about Thanksgiving." I let the silence sit there. He said, "I shouldn't have said what I said. I shouldn't have said what I said. About you being a saver. I don't know why I said it that way." I said, "I think you do know." Another silence. Longer. He said, "She didn't mean anything by it. Sylvie didn't." I said, "Preston, I'm not angry at Sylvie. I'm sad about you." He didn't say anything for a few seconds. When he spoke again, his voice was different, quieter, lower, the voice he had when he was young and something had gone wrong and he didn't want to admit it. He said, "What does that mean?" I said, "It means I raised you to look people in the eye when they're being diminished. And you looked away from me." He said, "Mom." I said, "I love you. I'll talk to you Sunday." And I said goodnight. I didn't sleep particularly well that night, but I didn't regret it either. February brought ice, and then a letter. The letter was from a commercial property company called Cabot Wren Holdings. It was addressed to my property management company, which forwarded it to me. I read it twice. Cabot Wren Holdings. Yes, Sylvie's family's company was currently leasing the entire third floor of one of my office buildings in Springfield. Had been for 4 years. I knew this in the way I know most things about my properties, as a line in a spreadsheet, a reliable income, nothing that required my attention. The letter was requesting a significant rent reduction, 30%, citing current market conditions and a period of operational restructuring. It was signed by Sylvie's father, Whitmore Cabot Wren. I set the letter down on my kitchen table. I thought about Constance's smile. I thought about the bond on the tablecloth. I thought about Preston cutting pecan pie. Then I called Josephine. She already knew she'd been CC'd. She said, "Do you want to negotiate?" I said, "I want to know the full picture first." She made some calls. Came back to me the following week with this. Cabot Wren Holdings had overextended during a commercial real estate push in 2022. They were carrying debt on 3 properties simultaneously, and the market had not cooperated. The Springfield office was one of their last stable operating costs. A 30% reduction wasn't a negotiating tactic. It was, from what Josephine could determine, close to necessary. They didn't know who owned the building. That detail is important. My ownership is held through a trust with a name that has nothing to do with my name. Josephine set it up that way on purpose, years ago, for exactly the kind of privacy that now turns out to have other uses. They had no idea. I thought for a long time. I took my walks. I had Vera over for soup and told her the whole thing. She sat there with her spoon halfway to her mouth for a long moment, and then she said, "Hattie Morse, your life is a book." I said, "What should I do?" She said, "What does it feel like you should do?" I said, "It feels like I should be fair." She said, "Then be fair." I did not reduce the rent. I also did not raise it or accelerate anything. The lease had 8 months remaining. I let it run. I did not respond to the letter with anything other than a standard acknowledgement through my property management company. What I did do was this. I had Josephine send Preston a letter in March, a formal letter not from me, from the trust. It outlined in plain language the structure I had put in place. It noted that Preston was named as a potential beneficiary, subject to trustee discretion. It listed the assets held by the trust. Josephine told me later that Preston called her within 2 hours of receiving it. She said he was very calm. He asked questions, practical ones, good ones, the kind that told her he'd understood the letter and taken it seriously. Then he called me. This time it was a Wednesday. Early evening. I was repotting a plant. He said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Tell you what exactly?" He said, "Any of it. The buildings, the trust, any of it." I said, "Would it have changed how you acted at Thanksgiving?" He was quiet. I said, "That's not a cruel question, Preston. I really want to know." He said slowly, "I don't know." I said, "That's an honest answer." He said, "Mom, I'm sorry. About Thanksgiving. About. I've been doing a lot of thinking since January, and I think I've been letting things happen that I should have stopped." I said, "Yes." He said, "That's all you're going to say?" I said, "What else do you want me to say? You know what you did. You know what it cost. I'm not going to argue about it." He said, "What happens now?" I said, "That depends on you, not on the trust. On you. I need to know that my son sees me, not what I might leave behind, not what I've saved up, just me. The woman who drove 40 minutes to every one of your baseball games in the rain, who hemmed your graduation trousers herself at 11 o'clock the night before, who kept your father's savings bond in a fireproof box for 29 years because she thought it meant something." He was quiet for a long time. I could hear him breathing. Then he said, "It did mean something. I knew it did. I just..." He stopped. I said, "Say it." He said, "I wanted her family to think we were." He stopped again. "I wanted them to think I was." I said, "Enough. You wanted them to think you were enough." He said, "Yes." I said, "Oh, sweetheart." And for a minute, neither of us said anything at all, and it was the truest conversation we'd had in 3 years. I should tell you what happened with Cabot Wren Holdings, because I know you're wondering. Their lease expired in October. They did not renew. I'm told, through the property management company, through channels, the way I learn most things, that they relocated to a smaller office in a less expensive building. The restructuring continues. I don't know the details, and I don't need to. Whitmore and Constance Cabot Wren never learned who owned the building. As far as I know, they still don't. That was never the point. The point was never to ruin anyone. The point was to stop quietly absorbing the cost of being underestimated. As for Sylvie, we are not close. I don't think we will be. But something shifted after the letter. After Preston and I started actually talking again. She called me in April, just called, out of the blue, on a Saturday, and apologized. She said she'd been raised to read people by their surfaces and she knew that was a failure. She said she was working on it. She sounded uncomfortable, which told me it was genuine. I said, "I appreciate you calling." I meant it. Preston comes for Sunday dinners now. Sometimes Sylvie comes, sometimes she doesn't. On the Sundays she does come, she brings something. Always something she made herself, not store-bought. I notice that. I don't say anything about it, but I notice. The baby. My granddaughter was born in May. Her name is June, which is a name Gerald would have loved. I was in the waiting room for 6 hours. When Preston came out and put her in my arms, this tiny, furious person with her grandfather's brow, I held her for a long time. I didn't cry until I got to my car. Then I cried for 20 minutes, which I think is the correct amount. The trust still stands, exactly as Josephine drew it up. Preston knows that. He's never asked me to change it. That tells me something important about who he's choosing to be. He called me last month. Sunday morning, usual time, but longer than usual. We talked for an hour. About his work, about June, about a documentary he'd watched about migratory birds. At the end, before he hung up, he said, "Mom, that bond, do you still have it?" I said, "Yes." He said, "I'd like June to have it when she's old enough. Is that okay?" I said, "That was always the plan." He said, "I know. I'm sorry I forgot." I said, "You remembered. That's the part that matters. I want to tell you something since you've listened this long. I am not a woman who believes in making people pay. That's not what any of this was. I never wanted Sylvie's family to lose their lease as punishment. I never wanted to frighten my son with a trust document. I wanted to stop disappearing. That's all. I had spent 3 years letting myself be quietly erased. From the dinner table. From the story of who my son was. From the category of people whose gifts mean something. And I was tired. When you are a woman of a certain age, who drives an older car and works a modest job and clips coupons, people will decide what you are worth before you open your mouth. Some of them will be polite about it. Some will be your daughter-in-law's mother. Some will be, God help you, the person you raised. What I learned from Gerald, what I will leave to June along with that savings bond, is this: your value is not announced. It is not worn or driven or hosted in. It accumulates quietly, in fireproof boxes and compounding interest and 45-minute walks, and the decision, made again every single day, to stay true to what you know is real. I went and bought myself a new coat last winter. Nothing extravagant. Wool, charcoal gray, good buttons. I wear it when I pick up June on Wednesday afternoons. She grabs the buttons with her little fist and pulls, the way babies do, testing what holds. Everything holds. That's what I want her to know. Long after I'm gone, through whatever comes, that's what I want her to carry. Everything holds if you build it right. I've thought a lot about why it took me so long. Not to act. I moved quickly enough once I decided. But to see clearly. To stop explaining away what was right in front of me. The honest answer is that I loved my son too much to look at him directly. When you love someone that way, you develop a habit of softening what you see. Sylvie didn't mean it. Constance was just being Constance. Preston was caught in the middle. I told myself these things for 3 years, and every time I told myself, I made myself a little smaller to fit the story. What I know now is that the shrinking doesn't protect anyone. It doesn't protect you, and it doesn't protect the person you're shrinking for. Preston didn't grow from my silence. He grew from the moment I said, "I am sad about you." Not angry, not wounded. Sad, because sadness is honest in a way that anger isn't always. Sadness says, "I expected more from you and I still do." Anger says, "You've already lost me." I wasn't ready to say that. I didn't want it to be true. The trust document wasn't a punishment. I need to be clear about that because I know how it looks from the outside. A woman restructures her estate after a bad Thanksgiving, and suddenly her son gets a letter from an attorney. It sounds like a threat. It wasn't. It was me finally putting a legal structure around something I had always known privately, that what I built had value, that my choices had been deliberate, that I was not an afterthought in my own story. The document just made it visible, made it impossible to look away from. And that's the thing about consequences. Real ones, not manufactured ones. They don't require cruelty. They just require honesty. The Cabot Wren lease ran out and wasn't renewed, and that was simply business conducted fairly with no sentiment attached. Preston received a letter that told him the truth about who his mother was, and that was simply long overdue. Neither of those things required me to be unkind. They only required me to stop pretending. Vera told me once, years ago, "Hattie, you can be the most patient person in the room or the most invisible one. You have to decide which you are." I used to think those were the same thing. They are not. Patience is a choice you make from strength. Invisibility is a slow erosion you allow from fear. Gerald understood this. He built quietly because he was patient, not because he was afraid. He never explained himself to anyone who hadn't earned the explanation. I forgot that for a while. 3 years, give or take. I let a dinner table and a set of people who measured everything by its surface convince me that my surfaces were my whole story. They were not. They never were. What I want for June. For my granddaughter, who grabs buttons with her little fist and pulls hard to see what holds, is that she never confuses those two things. That she learns early what took me 6 decades to fully trust, that the work you do in private, the integrity you keep when no one is watching, the patience you practice without applause, that is not invisible. It is the only thing that actually lasts. Everything else is tablecloth. Everything else gets cleared away.